When 72-year-old Margaret Chen rolled her wheelchair into her living room that Tuesday morning and saw her caregiver frantically shutting down a laptop, she had no idea she was about to discover the most shocking betrayal of her life. What happened next would not only expose a cruel exploitation, but transform her from a forgotten elderly woman into an unlikely internet sensation fighting for dignity and justice. The revelation waiting for her in that laptop screen would change everything she thought she knew about trust, technology, and her own worth in a world that had written her off. But the real shock came when she decided to turn the tables and join the very live stream that had been mocking her for months. What she found there and what she did about it would inspire millions and rewrite the rules of how we treat our most vulnerable. Margaret Chen never imagined that at 72, after a stroke had left her partially paralyzed and dependent on others, she would become the center of a story that would captivate the entire internet. Living alone in her modest two-bedroom house in Portland, Oregon, Margaret had been struggling with mobility issues for 3 years since her stroke. Her daughter Linda lived in Seattle, too far away to provide daily care, so they had hired 26-year-old Jessica Martinez through a reputable caregiving agency. Jessica seemed perfect, young, energetic, with excellent references and a warm smile that made Margaret feel like she had found not just a caregiver, but a friend. Margaret's world had become small since her stroke, confined mostly to her home, with Jessica as her primary companion for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. She trusted Jessica completely, grateful for her help with daily tasks, medication management, and the cheerful conversation that made the long days bearable. Margaret had worked as a librarian for 40 years before retiring, and though her speech was slightly slurred from the stroke, her mind remained sharp and her spirit unbroken. She had always been independent, and the transition to needing help had been difficult, but Jessica's presence made it manageable. What Margaret didn't know was that for the past 6 months, Jessica had been broadcasting their most private moments to thousands of online viewers, turning Margaret's vulnerability into entertainment and profit. If you're finding this story as shocking as I did when I first heard it, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because this journey is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Margaret's days had settled into a predictable routine since Jessica started working for her 18 months earlier. Every weekday morning at 8 sharp, she would hear Jessica's cheerful voice calling, "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," as she let herself in with the spare key. Margaret would already be awake in her hospital-style bed in the living room, having moved downstairs after her stroke made climbing stairs impossible. The living room had become her entire world. Her bed positioned near the large window overlooking the small garden her late husband Robert had lovingly maintained, her favorite armchair within rolling distance, and the television that served as her main connection to the outside world. Jessica would start each day by helping Margaret with her morning routine, assistance with bathing, dressing, and taking her multiple medications. Margaret took 7 different pills throughout the day for blood pressure, cholesterol, and stroke prevention, and Jessica had proven meticulous about timing and dosages. They would share breakfast together, usually oatmeal or eggs, while watching the morning news. Margaret enjoyed these conversations. Jessica was a good listener and would share stories about her evening college classes where she was studying communications, her boyfriend Miguel, and her dreams of eventually working in social media marketing. The afternoon hours were filled with physical therapy exercises that Jessica guided Margaret through, helping her maintain what mobility she had retained. Jessica would assist Margaret in walking short distances with her walker, exercising her partially paralyzed left arm, and doing the stretching routines prescribed by the physical therapist who visited twice a week. During these sessions, Margaret often struggled, sometimes feeling frustrated by her limitations, but Jessica was always encouraging, telling her she was doing great and that progress took time. Margaret particularly looked forward to their conversations during lunch. Jessica was studying social media and digital marketing at Portland Community College, and she would often work on assignments while Margaret rested. She frequently had her laptop open, claiming she was taking online classes or doing homework. Margaret, who had never fully adapted to modern technology beyond basic television operation, was impressed by Jessica's digital fluency. "You young people know so much about computers," she would often say, watching Jessica type rapidly on her keyboard. What Margaret didn't realize was that every mundane moment, every struggle with her exercises, every vulnerable instant was being broadcast live to an audience that had grown to over 3,000 regular viewers. The laptop Jessica claimed was for homework was actually streaming their interactions to a platform called Live, where viewers paid small amounts to watch real people in real situations. Jessica had started the stream as a side income, initially broadcasting herself doing homework or cooking, but discovered that her elderly client generated much more interest and money. The viewers, mostly people Jessica's age, found entertainment in Margaret's daily struggles. They would send donations with cruel comments like, "Make the old lady try to dance," or "Ask her about her dead husband." Jessica had created a character around Margaret without her knowledge, painting her as a cranky, difficult patient for comedic effect. She would roll her eyes at the camera when Margaret asked for help, make exaggerated gestures when Margaret moved slowly, and even stage situations to make Margaret appear more helpless than she was. Margaret's daughter Linda would call every Sunday evening for their weekly check-in. During these calls, Margaret always spoke positively about Jessica, grateful for her care and companionship. "She's such a sweet girl," Margaret would tell Linda. "Always so patient with me and so smart with all that computer work she does. I don't know what I'd do without her." Linda was relieved that her mother seemed content and well cared for, assuaging her guilt about not being able to provide the care herself due to her demanding job as a nurse manager in Seattle and her own family responsibilities with 2 teenage children. The routine continued for months without incident. Margaret's small Social Security check and pension covered Jessica's wages through the caregiving agency, along with her medications and basic living expenses, leaving little extra for luxuries. Margaret had grown to depend not just on Jessica's physical assistance, but on her emotional presence as well. The isolation of elderly life, especially after losing her husband 5 years earlier, made Jessica's companionship invaluable. Margaret would often tell Jessica personal stories about her teaching career, her marriage to Robert, and her hopes for her grandchildren's futures. But the comfortable routine was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. The morning that would change everything started like any other, with Jessica arriving at 8 o'clock sharp, her usual cheerful greeting echoing through the quiet house. Margaret noticed Jessica seemed a bit more rushed than usual, setting up her laptop on the kitchen table, where she normally worked on her assignments. What Margaret was about to discover would not only expose Jessica's betrayal, but set her on a path toward an extraordinary transformation that would inspire millions and redefine how society thinks about aging and dignity. The discovery happened by pure accident on a Tuesday morning in November. Margaret had been having trouble sleeping the night before and woke up earlier than usual, around 6:30. She decided to get herself some water from the kitchen, a journey that required her wheelchair and considerable effort. As she slowly wheeled toward the kitchen, she could hear Jessica's voice, which was unusual since Jessica typically arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. Confused and slightly concerned that something might be wrong, Margaret moved closer to investigate. Through the partially open kitchen door, she could see Jessica sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. But she wasn't alone. She was speaking animatedly to the computer screen, gesturing with her hands and laughing. "Oh my God, you guys, wait until you see what she does when I tell her about the physical therapy today," Jessica was saying to her screen. "Yesterday she took like 10 minutes just to walk to the bathroom. It was hilarious. The comments you sent were so funny." Margaret's heart began to pound as she listened, not understanding exactly what was happening, but sensing something was terribly wrong. Jessica continued talking to the screen. "Don't worry, she never suspects anything. She thinks I'm just doing homework on here. Yesterday, someone donated $50 just to see me make her try to reach something from the high shelf. She couldn't do it, obviously, and she got so frustrated. The viewers loved it." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She sat frozen in her wheelchair, trying to process what she was hearing. Jessica was talking about her, describing her daily struggles as entertainment for strangers. The humiliation and betrayal were overwhelming, but she forced herself to remain quiet and listen more. "Today, I'm thinking of asking her to tell that story again about her dead husband," Jessica continued. You guys loved that last week. She gets so emotional, and her speech gets all slurred when she cries. It's actually kind of pathetic, but the donations always spike when she talks about missing him. I made $300 that day alone. Margaret felt physically sick. Every intimate conversation, every moment of vulnerability, every private struggle had been turned into a public spectacle for money. The young woman she had trusted, had grown to care for like a daughter, had been systematically exploiting her most private moments. The realization that strangers had been watching her struggle with basic tasks, laughing at her limitations, and enjoying her emotional pain was devastating. She quietly wheeled herself back to her bed, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to confront Jessica immediately, but she was scared and didn't know how to handle the situation. She had never experienced anything like this before. In her generation, betrayals were more straightforward: affairs, financial theft, broken promises. This digital exploitation was foreign and frightening. When Jessica arrived at 8 o'clock for her official shift, she greeted Margaret with the same warm smile as always. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen. How are you feeling today?" Margaret struggled to respond normally, her voice shaking slightly as she said, "Fine, dear." Throughout the morning, Margaret watched Jessica differently, noticing things she had missed before. When Jessica helped her with exercises, she would position herself so the laptop camera had a clear view. When Margaret struggled with a task, Jessica would subtly encourage her to keep trying longer than necessary, creating more content for the viewers. During lunch, Jessica set up her laptop as usual, claiming she needed to work on an assignment. But now Margaret could see that Jessica was positioning the camera to capture both of them. Margaret noticed Jessica would speak louder when she was helping Margaret, performing her role as the caring caregiver for the audience while making subtle faces and gestures that mocked Margaret's limitations. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Margaret began second-guessing every interaction, wondering what the viewers were thinking, feeling exposed and humiliated even in her own home. Her appetite disappeared. Her sleep became even more disrupted, and she found herself becoming increasingly anxious about Jessica's presence. The sanctuary of her home no longer felt safe. But the real shock came when Margaret decided she had to know the full extent of the betrayal. That evening, after Jessica had left, Margaret used every ounce of determination to wheel herself to the computer desk in her late husband's old office. Robert had bought a computer years before his death and had taught Margaret some basics, though she had rarely used it since. With painstaking effort, she managed to turn it on and, after much trial and error, figured out how to search for information online. She didn't know the name of the platform Jessica was using, but she remembered hearing Live Life mentioned. After nearly an hour of frustrated searching, she found it, and what she discovered there would prove to be even more devastating than she could have imagined. The platform showed Jessica's profile with thousands of followers and a description that made Margaret's blood run cold. "Watch me take care of my crazy elderly patient. Daily doses of old people being old people. You won't believe the stuff she does. Donations appreciated for my patients." The viewer comments were even worse. Hundreds of messages mocking her appearance, her speech, her movements, and her stories about Robert. They referred to her as the old bat, wheelchair lady, and worse. People were literally paying money to watch her private moments and leaving cruel commentary about her age, her disability, and her vulnerability. Margaret sat in that computer chair for hours, scrolling through months of comments and donations, each one cutting deeper than the last. She saw that Jessica had been broadcasting her for over 6 months, that thousands of people had watched her most private moments, and that Jessica had earned thousands of dollars by turning her pain into entertainment. But as the shock began to settle, something else began to emerge in Margaret. A feeling she hadn't experienced since her stroke: anger. Not the frustrated anger of someone who couldn't open a jar or reach a high shelf, but the righteous anger of someone whose dignity had been stripped away and sold for profit. This wasn't just about her. This was about every elderly person, every vulnerable person who might be experiencing similar exploitation without their knowledge. The question now was what to do about it. Margaret knew she could fire Jessica, report her to the agency, maybe even involve the police. But she also realized this was an opportunity to expose not just Jessica, but an entire system that allowed the vulnerable to be exploited for entertainment. What Margaret was about to decide would set in motion a chain of events that would transform her from victim to advocate, from entertainment to inspiration. The days following Margaret's discovery were the darkest she had experienced since Robert's death. She barely slept, barely ate, and found herself jumping at every sound, wondering if she was being watched or recorded. The violation felt complete, not just of her privacy, but of her trust in humanity itself. She had opened her heart to Jessica, shared her most personal stories, revealed her deepest vulnerabilities, only to discover it was all being monetized and mocked. Margaret's first instinct was to call Linda, but shame held her back. How could she explain to her daughter that she had been so naive, so trusting, so utterly foolish? Linda had specifically chosen this caregiving agency for its reputation and thorough background checks. Margaret felt responsible for somehow allowing this to happen, though rationally she knew she was the victim. She considered firing Jessica immediately, but fear paralyzed her. What if Jessica became vindictive? What if she posted even more humiliating content out of spite? Margaret had seen enough of the internet comments to know how cruel people could be. The thought of even more strangers laughing at her was unbearable. For 3 days, Margaret maintained the pretense, allowing Jessica to continue her routine, while Margaret died a little inside with each interaction. Every time Jessica positioned the laptop camera, every time she made exaggerated gestures, every time she spoke in that artificially loud, patronizing voice for her audience, Margaret felt herself becoming smaller, more invisible, more worthless. The physical toll was immediate. Margaret's blood pressure spiked during Jessica's visits. She developed stress-related stomach problems, and her already limited mobility seemed to worsen as anxiety made her movements more tentative and fearful. The simple acts of eating breakfast or doing her exercises became performances she dreaded, knowing that strangers were watching and commenting on her every struggle. On Thursday evening, Margaret made the mistake of returning to the Live Life platform to read more comments. She told herself she needed to understand the full scope of the situation, but in reality, she was torturing herself. The comments from the past week were particularly cruel, with viewers making jokes about her shaking hands, her slurred speech, and her emotional vulnerability. One comment that particularly devastated her read, "This old lady is so pathetic. Why doesn't she just die already and save everyone the trouble?" That comment broke something fundamental in Margaret. She sat at her computer crying until she had no tears left, feeling utterly alone in a world that saw her as nothing more than a burden or a source of entertainment. The woman who had spent 40 years teaching children, who had volunteered at literacy programs, who had raised a successful daughter and been a loving wife, felt reduced to nothing more than a joke for strangers to mock. The lowest point came on Friday morning when Jessica arrived with unusual excitement. "Mrs. Chen, I have such good news," she announced, setting up her laptop with particular care. "I've been selected for a special feature on the platform I use for my schoolwork. They want to showcase exemplary caregiving, and they chose me. Isn't that wonderful? We might have some extra visitors watching today." Margaret realized that Jessica's special feature meant even more people would be watching her humiliation. The platform was promoting their stream, which meant potentially thousands of new viewers would witness her private struggles. The thought made her feel physically sick. During that Friday session, Jessica was particularly performative, speaking louder, making more exaggerated gestures, and even staging situations that would showcase Margaret's limitations. She accidentally placed Margaret's medication just out of reach, then made a show of helping her retrieve it. She encouraged Margaret to tell a story about Robert, knowing it would make her emotional for the audience's entertainment. As Margaret spoke about her late husband, tears streaming down her face as they always did when she remembered their last days together. She could see Jessica glancing at her laptop screen, reading comments in real time. Jessica's smile grew wider as the donations came in, and Margaret realized that her pain was literally being converted into profit in real time. That afternoon, after Jessica left, Margaret reached her absolute lowest point. She sat in her wheelchair, staring out the window at Robert's garden, now overgrown and neglected, feeling as forgotten and worthless as the dying plants. She thought about the viewer's comment suggesting she should just die, and for the first time since her stroke, she wondered if they might be right. What was the point of continuing when her existence brought nothing but mockery and entertainment for cruel strangers? Margaret spent that entire weekend in a deep depression, barely eating, not answering Linda's weekly call, and contemplating giving up entirely. She felt trapped in a situation where maintaining her care meant enduring ongoing humiliation, but ending the arrangement would leave her without the help she genuinely needed. The agency would send another caregiver, but how could she trust anyone again? How could she be sure this wasn't happening elsewhere, to other vulnerable people who had no idea they were being exploited? By Sunday evening, Margaret had made a decision that felt like her only option. She would endure the humiliation in silence rather than face the upheaval and uncertainty of finding new care. She convinced herself that she deserved this treatment, that perhaps she really was as pathetic and burdensome as the comments suggested. At 72, partially paralyzed and completely dependent on others, maybe this was simply the price of staying alive. But sometimes our lowest points become the foundation for our greatest transformations. As Margaret sat in her darkened living room that Sunday night, something began to shift in her thinking. The woman who had spent decades teaching children that they had worth and potential, who had fought for literacy programs in underserved communities, who had advocated for her students throughout her career, began to remember who she had been before she became defined by her limitations. The anger that had been buried under shame and fear began to resurface, but this time it was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every elderly person being secretly exploited, every vulnerable individual being turned into entertainment without their consent, every person whose dignity was being sold for profit. Margaret began to realize that staying silent wasn't protecting her. It was enabling a system that treated human vulnerability as a commodity. What Margaret decided to do next would not only reclaim her own dignity, but expose a widespread problem that society had been ignoring. The woman who felt worthless and forgotten was about to discover that she had more power than she ever imagined, and that sometimes the most profound transformations begin in our darkest moments. Monday morning brought a clarity that Margaret hadn't felt in days. She woke with a sense of purpose that surprised her, not the heavy dread that had characterized the past week, but something she hadn't experienced since her teaching days, the determination to right a wrong. As she waited for Jessica's 8 o'clock arrival, Margaret had already formulated a plan that was both simple and revolutionary. She had spent Sunday night thinking not just about her own situation, but about other elderly people who might be experiencing similar exploitation. Margaret remembered her teaching career, how she had always advocated for students who couldn't advocate for themselves. The realization struck her that she was now the vulnerable person who needed an advocate, and maybe, just maybe, she could be that advocate not just for herself, but for others. When Jessica arrived that Monday morning with her usual cheerful greeting, Margaret was ready. She had positioned herself in her wheelchair near the window, in clear view of where Jessica would set up her laptop. But instead of dreading the camera's presence, Margaret had decided to use it. "Good morning, Jessica," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "I need to tell you something important today." Jessica, busy setting up her laptop and checking her camera angle, responded distractedly. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. What is it?" Margaret waited until she was sure Jessica had started the live stream, until she could see the viewer count climbing on the laptop screen that Jessica had carelessly left turned toward her. Then she took a deep breath and began to speak directly to the camera. "Hello to everyone watching this live stream," Margaret said clearly, her librarian training helping her project her voice despite her speech difficulties. "My name is Margaret Chen, and I want you to know that I have been aware of your presence for several days now." Jessica's face went pale as she realized what was happening. She reached for her laptop, but Margaret continued speaking, louder now. "Please don't turn off the camera, Jessica. I think your viewers deserve to hear what I have to say." The chat exploded with confusion and excitement. Viewers who had been watching Margaret for months without her knowledge were now witnessing her directly addressing them. The viewer count began climbing rapidly as people shared the stream, sensing that something unprecedented was happening. For the past 6 months, Margaret continued, looking directly at the camera, I have unknowingly been the subject of your entertainment. Jessica, my caregiver, has been broadcasting my private moments, my struggles with disability, my grief over my deceased husband, and my daily battles with the aftermath of my stroke. She has made thousands of dollars by turning my vulnerability into your amusement. Jessica was frantically trying to end the stream, but her hands were shaking and she couldn't navigate the controls properly. The viewer count had exploded to over 10,000 people as word spread across social media that something extraordinary was happening on the Live Life platform. I want you to understand something, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. I am not entertainment. I am not a joke. I am a human being with dignity, with a lifetime of experiences, with value that doesn't diminish because I need help with daily tasks, or because I move slowly, or because my speech isn't perfect anymore. The chat, which had been filled with cruel jokes and mocking comments for months, began to change. People were writing things like, "Oh my God, she knew the whole time?" And "This is not okay," and "We've been watching someone without their consent." Margaret continued, I was a teacher for 40 years. I helped hundreds of children learn to read, to think critically, to believe in themselves. I volunteered in my community. I raised a daughter who is now saving lives as a nurse. I cared for my husband through his final illness. My worth isn't defined by what I can no longer do, but by who I am and what I've contributed to the world. By now, Jessica had managed to close her laptop, but it was too late. The clip was already being shared across social media platforms, but Margaret wasn't finished. She had more to say, and she was going to say it whether the cameras were rolling or not. Jessica, Margaret turned to face her caregiver, who was now crying and trying to explain. I trusted you. I shared my most personal stories with you because I thought you cared about me as a person. Instead, you turned my pain into profit and my struggles into entertainment. Do you have any idea how many elderly people might be experiencing this same violation right now? That afternoon, everything changed at lightning speed. The live stream clip had gone viral across multiple platforms with millions of views and tens of thousands of shares. News outlets were picking up the story. Disability rights organizations were demanding investigations, and the Live Life platform was facing intense scrutiny. Margaret's phone, which had been quiet for months, began ringing constantly with calls from reporters, advocacy groups, and other elderly people sharing their own stories of suspected exploitation. But the most important call came from Linda, who had seen the viral clip and immediately driven down from Seattle. When Linda arrived that evening, she found her mother transformed. Instead of the defeated, withdrawn woman she had been becoming, Margaret was energized and focused in a way Linda hadn't seen since before the stroke. Mom, Linda said through tears, I'm so sorry this happened to you. I had no idea. We're going to make sure Jessica faces consequences, and we're going to find you proper care. Linda, Margaret replied, I don't want this to be just about me anymore. Do you realize how many vulnerable people might be experiencing this same exploitation right now? How many families have no idea that their loved ones are being turned into entertainment? Over the next few days, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of retreating from the public eye, she decided to use the attention her story was generating to advocate for stronger protections for vulnerable adults. She began speaking to reporters, sharing her story not for pity or sympathy, but to educate people about the reality of elder exploitation in the digital age. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people reached out sharing similar experiences or expressing newfound awareness of these issues. Advocacy organizations invited Margaret to speak at conferences and participate in policy discussions. Most importantly, other elderly people who had suspected they were being exploited found the courage to speak up, leading to dozens of investigations and policy changes. Margaret realized that her moment of greatest vulnerability had become her moment of greatest power. By refusing to remain silent, by using the very platform that had been exploiting her to expose the exploitation, She had not only reclaimed her own dignity, but had started a movement that would protect countless others. But this transformation was just the beginning. Margaret was about to discover that her new role as an advocate would lead to opportunities and experiences she never could have imagined, proving that sometimes our greatest challenges become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions to the world. 6 months after confronting Jessica on that live stream, Margaret's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. Her modest Portland home had become the headquarters of what she called the Dignity First Initiative, a grassroots movement focused on protecting vulnerable adults from digital exploitation. The same living room where she had been secretly filmed for months was now filled with laptops, phones, and stacks of letters from people around the world sharing their stories and seeking help. Linda had taken leave from her job in Seattle to help manage the overwhelming response to Margaret's story. The viral livestream confrontation had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms, leading to documentary offers, book deals, and speaking engagements. But Margaret had carefully chosen to focus her newfound platform on advocacy rather than personal profit. The Dignity First Initiative, which Margaret had founded with the help of several disability rights organizations, had already achieved remarkable success. They had worked with legislators to introduce the Margaret Chen Act in Oregon, requiring explicit consent for any filming or live streaming in caregiving situations. The legislation was being considered in 12 other states, and similar laws were being proposed at the federal level. Margaret's daily routine now included video calls with other advocates, interviews with journalists, and consultations with families who suspected their loved ones were being exploited. Her speech had improved dramatically through the intensive practice required by her new role, and her confidence had returned in ways that amazed her doctors and therapists. Mrs. Chen has experienced what we might call post-traumatic growth, explained Dr. Sarah Kim, the geriatrician who had been treating Margaret since her stroke. The experience of trauma, when processed in a supportive environment with a sense of purpose, can actually lead to significant improvements in both physical and mental health. Margaret's cognitive function, emotional resilience, and even her physical therapy progress have all accelerated since she began her advocacy work. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was systemic. The Live Life platform had implemented strict new policies requiring documented consent for filming anyone over 65 or anyone with disabilities. They had also created an Elder Dignity Committee to review content and respond to exploitation complaints. Jessica Martinez faced criminal charges for exploitation of a vulnerable adult and civil penalties that cost her the thousands of dollars she had earned from Margaret's pain. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret's story had started a national conversation about how society treats its elderly and disabled members. Nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and home care agencies across the country had implemented new training programs and oversight procedures to prevent similar exploitation. Margaret's speaking engagements had taken her across the country, sharing her story at conferences, universities, and policy forums. Each appearance reinforced her transformation from victim to advocate, from invisible to influential. At a conference for geriatric care professionals in Chicago, Margaret addressed an audience of over 2,000 healthcare workers. "I want you to understand that when you work with elderly or disabled individuals, you're not working with broken people who need to be managed or entertained," she told them. "You're working with human beings who have lived full lives, who have wisdom and experience and dignity that doesn't disappear because their bodies have changed. Every person in your care was once young, was once someone's baby, someone's hope for the future. They deserve respect, privacy, and dignity, not exploitation." The financial impact of Margaret's advocacy had been unexpected but welcome. Speaking fees, book deals, and donations to her initiative had provided more financial security than Margaret had enjoyed since Robert's death. But more importantly, the work had given her life a purpose she hadn't felt since retiring from teaching. Margaret's relationship with technology had completely transformed. The woman who had once been intimidated by computers was now managing social media campaigns, participating in video conferences, and using her digital platform to reach millions of people. She had learned to use the same tools that had been used to exploit her to instead empower others. The Dignity First initiative had grown from Margaret's living room operation to a national organization with chapters in 30 states. They provided resources for families to detect potential exploitation, training for caregivers and healthcare workers, and support for victims of similar crimes. Margaret served as the organization's president, a role that utilized all of her teaching and organizational skills. One of Margaret's proudest achievements was the Dignity First Caregiver certification program, which provided additional training and credentialing for home care workers who wanted to demonstrate their commitment to ethical, respectful care. The program had already certified over 5,000 caregivers nationwide and was being adopted by major healthcare organizations. Margaret's story had also led to surprising personal connections. She had formed friendships with disability rights activists, technology ethicists, and other elderly advocates from around the world. Her social circle, which had shrunk dramatically after her stroke, was now larger and more diverse than it had ever been. The isolation that had made her vulnerable to exploitation had been replaced by a network of meaningful relationships built around shared purpose. The physical improvements in Margaret's condition were remarkable. The increased activity, purpose, and confidence had led to significant improvements in her mobility and speech. She was now able to walk short distances without her wheelchair and had regained much of the function in her left arm. Her doctors attributed these improvements to the mental and emotional benefits of her advocacy work. Linda watched her mother's transformation with amazement and pride. "It's like she's become more herself than she was even before the stroke," Linda told a reporter. "The adversity brought out strengths and capabilities that we didn't even know she had. She's always been smart and caring, but now she's also fearless and influential in ways that are inspiring to watch." Margaret's story had become a case study in business schools, social work programs, and gerontology courses. Her transformation from victim to advocate illustrated important principles about resilience, the power of purpose, and the potential for positive change at any age. The woman who had once felt worthless and forgotten had become a symbol of dignity and empowerment for millions of people. But Margaret's greatest satisfaction came from the individual stories of people she had helped. Families who had discovered their loved ones were being exploited, caregivers who had improved their practices, and elderly individuals who had found the courage to advocate for themselves. Each success story reinforced Margaret's belief that the trauma she had experienced had ultimately served a greater purpose. The transformation was complete, but the work was far from over. Margaret knew that exploitation of vulnerable adults was an ongoing problem that required constant vigilance and advocacy. But she also knew that she had found her calling, and at 73 years old, she was just getting started. As Margaret reflects on her journey from victim to advocate, sitting in the same living room where her world was shattered and then rebuilt, she often thinks about the unexpected ways that life can transform our greatest challenges into our most meaningful contributions. The violation that once made her feel worthless and invisible ultimately made her more visible and valuable than she had ever imagined possible. Margaret's story offers profound lessons that extend far beyond elder care or digital exploitation. Her experience demonstrates that dignity isn't something that can be taken from us. It's something that can only be surrendered, and Margaret chose never to surrender hers. When faced with the ultimate violation of her privacy and trust, she didn't retreat into shame or victimhood. Instead, she transformed her pain into purpose and her vulnerability into strength. The first crucial lesson from Margaret's journey is that age and disability don't diminish our worth or our potential for impact. At 72, partially paralyzed and dependent on others for daily care, Margaret accomplished more meaningful change than many people achieve in entire careers. Her story challenges society's assumptions about aging and shows that our value isn't determined by what we can no longer do, but by who we choose to be in the face of adversity. The second lesson is about the power of speaking truth directly to those who would exploit or mock our struggles. When Margaret looked into that camera and addressed her unwitting audience, she didn't plead or apologize. She educated. She transformed a moment of entertainment into a moment of reckoning forcing thousands of people to confront their complicity in her exploitation. This demonstrates that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is not anger or revenge, but truth delivered with dignity and strength. Margaret's experience also teaches us about the importance of community and purpose in healing from trauma. The isolation that made her vulnerable to exploitation was ultimately healed through connection with others who shared her mission. Her advocacy work didn't just help others. It helped her discover strengths and capabilities she didn't know she possessed. This illustrates how serving something larger than ourselves can be one of the most powerful forms of therapy and personal growth. Perhaps most importantly, Margaret's story shows us that it's never too late to become who we're meant to be. The stroke that seemed to end one chapter of her life actually prepared her for the most important chapter. The skills she developed as a teacher, the ability to educate, advocate, and inspire, proved to be exactly what the world needed from her in this new role. Her lifetime of experience became the foundation for her effectiveness as an advocate. The technological aspect of Margaret's story offers important lessons about digital literacy and protection for vulnerable populations. Her transformation from someone intimidated by computers to someone using technology to create positive change shows that age is no barrier to adapting to new tools. But it also highlights the need for better protections and education around digital exploitation, especially for populations that may not fully understand how their privacy can be violated online. Margaret's journey also demonstrates the ripple effects of individual courage. One woman's decision to speak up led to legislative changes, policy reforms, improved training programs, and a national conversation about dignity and respect for vulnerable populations. This shows how personal transformation can become social transformation when we channel our experiences toward helping others. The story also reveals important truths about resilience and post-traumatic growth. Margaret didn't just recover from her exploitation. She used it as a catalyst for becoming stronger, more purposeful, and more impactful than she had been before the trauma occurred. This doesn't minimize the pain of what she experienced, but it demonstrates that we have the power to determine what our suffering ultimately means and how it shapes our future. For families with elderly or disabled loved ones, Margaret's experience offers both warning and hope. The warning is that exploitation can happen anywhere, by anyone, and that vigilance and communication are essential for protection. The hope is that recovery and growth are possible even after serious violations of trust, and that the right support and purpose can lead to remarkable transformations. Margaret's story also challenges us to examine our own attitudes toward aging and disability. How often do we see elderly or disabled individuals as burdens rather than human beings with continuing value and potential? How often do we dismiss their capabilities rather than finding ways to support their contributions? Margaret's transformation asks us to reconsider these assumptions and to see the potential for growth, impact, and meaning at every stage of life. The final lesson from Margaret's journey is perhaps the most universal, that our response to adversity defines us more than the adversity itself. Margaret could have chosen silence, shame, or withdrawal. Instead, she chose courage, advocacy, and service. She transformed her worst experience into her greatest contribution, proving that we always have the power to choose how we respond to life's challenges. Today, at 73, Margaret continues her advocacy work with the same passion and determination that marked her teaching career. She has traveled the country, spoken to hundreds of thousands of people, and helped create systemic changes that will protect vulnerable adults for generations to come. The woman who once felt invisible and worthless has become a powerful voice for dignity and justice. Her story reminds us that transformation is possible at any age, that purpose can emerge from pain, and that the courage to speak truth can create change far beyond what we might imagine. Margaret's journey from exploitation to empowerment shows us that our greatest challenges can become our greatest opportunities to make a difference in the world. As Margaret often tells the audiences who come to hear her speak, don't let anyone convince you that your age, your disability, or your circumstances define your worth or limit your potential. Every person has value, every voice matters, and it's never too late to stand up for what's right. Sometimes, the very experience that seems designed to break you becomes the foundation for everything you're meant to build. If Margaret's story has inspired you to think differently about aging, dignity, or the power of speaking up for what's right, I encourage you to share it with others who might need to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of transformation and resilience. Give this video a thumbs up if it moved you, and let me know in the comments what lessons from Margaret's journey resonated most with you. Sometimes the stories that challenge us the most are the ones we most need to hear, and sometimes the people society overlooks are the ones with the most important messages to share. Margaret Chen's extraordinary transformation reminds us that it's never too late to become who we're meant to be, and that our greatest struggles can become our most powerful contributions to making the world a better place.